Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Here with you is my mother, Clara.
Hello, everyone.
And myself, Jimmy Hinton. And today we want to talk about something that's pretty fresh on our minds because we had at our congregation on Sunday, Christine Parker, a friend of mine from Porch Swing Ministries. If you've not checked out Porch Swing Ministries, go over to porchswingministries.org and check out that ministry. It started back in September, and it's really cool. It's a cool ministry. I serve on the board, so maybe I'm a little biased, but I really, really like what Porch Swing is doing, and it's bringing an awareness and helping to build community with people who are what I call the spiritual outcasts, people who cannot go back to church because they've just been so traumatized by church abuse. The way that the church handles or mishandles cases of abuse, whether it's domestic violence or sexual abuse, or even other forms of spiritual abuse. The way that the church responds has devastating impacts. If they don't respond right, it has devastating impacts on the victims of abuse.
Jimmy, let me interject here. I thought Christine did a marvelous job of explaining why this trauma, how it works on victims, survivors of abuse, and why so many cannot set foot in a church building. And there may be people listening who are saying that's not true. Everybody can walk through the doors of a church, but you want to expand a little bit on what Christine said and how that works in the mind and heart of those who have been abused but have not been treated right by the church leadership, by church members and leadership.
Well, yeah, and that I'm working on editing, and it's been a busy week, so the video of that class is going to be up next week. I'm not going to make any promises for this week because it's not going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
So we will have that video up, but yeah, in a nutshell, that part of it I thought was really brilliant because I had asked her the question.
Okay.
In class I said, what's it like? Help us to slip into the shoes of an abuse survivor. So for myself as a preacher, I want to know, because I still, even though I have empathy, I still don't fully understand what that feeling is like, what that sensation is like to walk into a church building and to vomit, or to walk into a church building and to have a panic attack. I've never experienced that in my life, but I've never been abused by the church. So I wouldn't know what that's like. So I just asked her to describe it, and she started talking about. She asked the question, "What's your favorite song? Name your favorite song."
I loved that question, by the way.
And so people started telling what their favorite songs were, and she said, "Okay, what do you feel right now? Just by thinking about that song, what do you feel right now?" And so, some of the people were saying, "Well, I feel warmth, or I feel
peace."
Yeah, peace.
Peaceful.
Well, where do you feel that? And one of our church members said, "Well, I feel it's in my chest. I feel warmth in my chest right now." And so, she said exactly. Christine said exactly. And for me, there was a song that popped in the head where I had this memory. It was a wild memory. But it was with one of my very best friends from clear back in high school. And, this moment was inside of a hay truck, a commercial vehicle, and it almost ended in a crash into gas pumps, literally. And it was wild. And so she said, where do you feel that? Mm-hmm. Or how do you feel? And I said, I was in that truck. When she said to remember your favorite song, I was inside of that truck as if I were there. And she said, exactly. So she said, you don't control that. That's just a physiological response where your body responds because we store memories that way. We store emotions that way. And whether it's a positive emotion or a negative emotion, our body remembers it that way.
And I think that's what we need to remember as we're working through this podcast today, that this is a feeling that you associate with when you walk through those church doors or when you walk up the
whether you realize it or not.
Right. It's there. As a kid, I loved church so much because that meant 2 hours when my mom and dad were not arguing and fighting. It was every Sunday morning. I was up as a little kid, and the first thing I would say is, are we going to church today? And if we were, never did I have to be told, get ready, brush your teeth. I was ready. I knew that would be a time of peace. For my parents fought terribly, but during those 2 hours, it was wonderful. And so I associated that feeling, with church was just the best thing that could happen for me. But, and then there are others who have experienced, like Christine was explaining, these horrible feelings because they have been abused by the church. And I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so I think, it's interesting for me because, our church leadership, and I've even caught myself doing this before, where because we've not had that negative experience, for us, to not go to corporate worship, to not go to church, it's just a matter of which really laziness, or we didn't feel like it. Well, for me, it's a little harder because I'm on payroll. But when we're traveling or whatever, if we don't make it to church for whatever reason, it's not because we couldn't be there. It's just because, something else came up, or you get to a point where you just didn't
correctly, but it wasn't,
or you didn't feel like it, or you know what I mean. So leadership tends to apply that to everybody and say, well, if you're not here, then you're not committed enough, or you don't love the Lord enough, or you're letting the worldly things creep into your life, and all these things that we hear. And so when survivors of abuse try to explain it to those leaders, what ends up happening is they say things like, well, you're just being too emotional. You're being overreactive. You're too sensitive to abuse. You don't have enough faith. You're harboring bitterness in your heart. And so these are all the cliches that come back.
Forgiven.
Yeah, you haven't forgiven. These are all the cliches that come back to the abuse survivors, and it's just not true. Well,
it's being abused again. I thought Christine explained so well when she said, I love the Lord. I love the Lord.
And they love the church. They don't want to leave the church.
I love the church. That was my family.
Yeah.
And she said it passionately and meant it. But when you've experienced that kind of hurt that she's talking about, it makes it physically impossible when you walk through those doors, because you're so afraid. You have experienced that trauma, that pain, and your body takes over. Those feelings take over. And you can try to separate it. You can try to talk yourself out of it, but it takes a lot of work, therapy, as she explained, to get to that point. And we need to be understanding of that.
Yeah. And I think too, it's really important for church leaders to know that when people walk away, when people who've been abused, they finally make that decision to walk away, that wasn't a lighthearted decision, that it pains them to walk away because that's their family. And it further increases the alienation,
right?
And it decreases the community that they don't so desperately need and desire. And so, the issue is not with the survivors leaving the church. It's not that they're turning their backs on God. It's quite the opposite. Right. They're longing for God. They're longing for a community that just listens to them, that understands their pain.
To be scooped up. When you kids were little and you would get hurt and be wailing and crying and all, I can remember bending down and picking you kids up most of the time, except for you, Jimmy. I let you scream and cry.
I know.
Just kidding.
I know. You're terrible.
But, but bringing that child...
I'm missing my left toe, but hey, whatever. It's all good.
Bringing that child close and really holding them up against my heart, and squeezing and just keep saying, it's going to be okay. It'll be okay. Mm-hmm. It'll be okay. And calming that child down. And that's how I picture the church as needing to be to survivors of those who have been abused.
Well, that's exactly what Jesus did to oppressed people.
Right.
Jesus was very welcoming to people who had been oppressed, to the spiritual outcast, to the people who had not graced a synagogue service, some of them for years, because of whether it was, because of purification rites that, you had the woman with the issue of bleeding she was hemorrhaging for 12 years. She was not allowed to enter into a worship service because she was unclean. She was a spiritual outcast. Mm-hmm. She was certainly not accepted by the community. And, you had all these people who had been oppressed, who had been thrown out, kicked out, or made to feel unwelcome. And they flocked to Jesus because Jesus provided that nurturing care. He listened. He cared, and he loved, and he protected. He protected them from the oppressors who had caused the harm to them, which is why the religious leaders really didn't like him. He clashed badly with the religious leaders. And it's not that Jesus hated leadership and was bucking the system. It's that Jesus was protecting the innocent and the vulnerable from the people who heaped abuse on top of the abused.
Right. When I picture Jesus, I picture him as this person with outstretched arms, compassion, just a holy compassion. And that's what's needed. Now, the reason, is not given, or there's a multitude of reasons, but I think that you and Christine certainly hit on a lot of it. There is a judgment, whether we want to call it that or not, of the abused, and there are standards that people have set for the abused. And the first being one that you've talked about for weeks and weeks, that the abused person must forgive, that the abused person, I'm thinking too about those who...
Not just forgive unconditionally.
Oh, yeah.
Which is total nonsense. It's not biblical. It's not a biblical concept.
Not at all. And you explained that so well in your series on forgiveness. I thought you did a phenomenal job on that. But, when you have these burdens on your heart already and you're broken, totally broken, you are not in a spiritual position to be giving to others, heaven forbid. You are in need of being built up, and your whole, the whole body of Jesus needs to be wrapped around you. And instead, we're given directive or words like you're weak in faith, you've wandered from the Lord, these are wrong. And like I said, whether we want to call them judgments or not, I call them judgments. We make judgments about people when they stay away from church. And it just adds to the brokenness.
Well, I want to hit on a couple points. And, one, Christine rightly talked about, our emotions, good and bad, which is kind of a silly concept anyway, right? Like, who decides that crying is a bad thing?
Right.
The Psalms say that God bottles up our tears and keeps record of every one of them. God holds our tears close to his heart and records them. But we associate crying with being a negative emotion.
And being weak.
And being, a sign of weakness, and which isn't true. We were designed to be able to cry. It's an indicator of pain, and it's a way to release. And it's an emotion. I mean, it's an emotion that God created. And so when we start associating those emotions with negativity as something that you need to get over, as being too expressive of your emotions, you're too emotional, you're too bitter, you're too stuck on this whole abuse thing. And as a Christian, you need to just forgive and move on. That's total nonsense, number one. And number two, that is a deep form of spiritual abuse. And here's why. You had given the analogy about, falling down. As a kid, you fall down, you get hurt. Your parent comes and scoops you up and assures you that things are going to be okay. Imagine, and for all of you survivors, you don't have to imagine it because you're living it. Imagine that kid, first of all, is yelled at for falling down.
Right. Oh.
That the first response is, well, what the heck were you doing that you wrecked your bike anyway? But then you scoop the kid up, not in a compassionate manner, but in an angry manner. And if the kid's lucky enough, you take the kid to the hospital. You walk inside where somebody's supposed to be a shepherd of healing, and that doctor starts yelling at the kid, saying, you need to just get over it. You're too emotional.
Crying.
Yeah, stop crying.
As bad as you
yeah,
think.
You're too emotional.
Right.
And so eventually what the child learns is that when I get hurt, when I get physically hurt, I get yelled at. And so when I get physically hurt, the way to not get yelled at is to what? Remain silent.
Right. You no longer
bottle
go
it
to
up.
the parent.
No.
You no longer go. You keep it in. You turn and you go the other way and you weep alone.
Yeah. You don't tell anybody.
No.
You certainly don't go to the hospital, because if you go to the hospital at the place that's supposed to heal those wounds, you're going to get yelled at by the doctor.
That is such a powerful example, Jimmy. I just love it. I absolutely love that, because I think every one of us can understand that.
Well, I think the other. Let's take this another step farther, because this is the next level that they experience. Imagine if a doctor somehow finds out, say that you put on social media that you've been injured, that doctor now is calling you saying, you need to come to the hospital. You haven't been to the hospital in a week, and so you're forsaking the assembly, the gathering of the hospital. Right. This is what abuse survivors experience. And so it's not just the abuse. It's not just getting yelled at or told that you're too emotional, that you shouldn't be crying, that you need to get over your injuries. It's not just all of that, but then it's compounded, because then they're told, if you don't come to the place that's hurling insults at you, now you're unfaithful to God, you're unfaithful to the community of the church, and God's now mad at you.
And that is the ultimate, I think. That is injury on top of injury, and that is the camel, the straw so-called, that breaks the camel's back and makes people turn and never want to go back again. Never.
Well, I think all of us,
it's a protective measure.
All of us as humans understand this concept, because we've seen people who've had bad experiences with doctors and with hospitals where something went south. Yeah. Something went horribly wrong. And I've seen people, when they walk into a hospital, that they immediately get anxious. Just the thought of going to the hospital, they get anxious.
My blood pressure rises immediately when I, go for a checkup even. I was in labor once or twice before. I had a doctor get in my face about an inch away and yell at me. And, I just really screamed at me. And I'll tell you what, I have never forgotten what that felt like. And to this day, I can't walk in a doctor's office without, there's a great fear.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I have a horrible fear. I know I need to go for checkups, but guaranteed when I go next week, my blood pressure will be elevated. And I can't control it. I've been trying to, I talk to myself about it all the time. But these are super examples, Jimmy, that you're bringing up. There's one more something that we don't always think about, but that the abused have talked about. When you walk through that door and there's a known abuser or the abuser of the person, and you have to sit in that same assembly and worship with that person. Tell me how that's done. It's just
again, this goes back.
Demanded.
Absolutely. So this goes back to, say the doctor. And I have, one time I had a verbally abusive doctor, and I just gave it right back to him. But
I didn't.
But children can't do that. And abuse survivors, again, they're conditioned to not speak up. They're certainly conditioned to not speak up on behalf of themselves and to defend themselves, because if they do, then all hell is going to break loose, and they're going to have a whole community after them. So again, I've not experienced that. So for me, I had a doctor who, actually, you'll remember this because you're the one who told me to go to the hospital. So I'm going to blame it on you.
Thank you. Okay.
But it was what I thought was maybe a spider bite, and my arm was turning black and it was following my veins.
I do remember that.
There were two little holes, and I never felt anything, and it didn't hurt or anything like that, but it was starting to spread up my veins, and then at some point my fingers started to go numb. And you're the one who told me, you need to get to the hospital because this is following a vein, and it's so headed up for your armpit, there's some kind of poisoning, and we don't know what caused it. You need to go to the doctor or the hospital. It was on a weekend.
Right.
And so I went up there, and this doctor just berated me. And he was just a flat out jerk. And he wanted to know why I was in the ER for that. And he said, "Why didn't you go to the doctor when this happened?" And I said, "Because it's a weekend." I said, "I literally woke up this morning and this is what it looked like." And I said, "It's spreading by the hour."
I know that doctor, by the way.
Yeah, I don't think he's there anymore, thank God.
No, he is not. Yeah.
So, he just, every time he walked back into the room, he just had another smart aleck comment. And
kind of that look of disgust, too, like demeaning.
Oh, yeah.
And we all know that. Yeah.
So finally he came back in, and I was like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "What am I doing where?" And I said, "In the ER." I was like, if you're this miserable being an ER doctor that you got to talk to your patients this way for people who come in for help, get out. Give me another doctor or something. But I was like, I don't understand why you're here. I don't understand why you're an ER doctor if it stresses you out to take care of your patients. It's not like my leg was severed or anything like that. It was some kind of infection, and who knows what it was. Yeah. I still don't know what it was. He didn't know what it was. But he was just so agitated with me. And so, anyway, all that to say, if you have a doctor, though, who's not just being verbally assaulting you in the privacy of the room, but he pulls the door shut and he's sexually assaulting the patient, and he's doing all these horrific things to them. When you have people who keep demanding that you go back to see that doctor, and say, this is what God wants. Right. God wants you to forgive, to move on, and to put this behind you, and you need to keep coming here. That's so stinking traumatizing and so unbiblical and just evil. It's wicked.
Evil. I don't think we can truly put it into words. And where we're going with this is what happens to these people who turn away from the church. Where do they go?
Well, they have nowhere to go, and that's why Porch Swing Ministries was born, because there's a lot of them out there that they have a deep faith in God, that they long for community, that they've been abandoned or kicked out by their church community, and they're just desperate to be heard, and they're desperate for community, they're desperate for healing, and if they step foot back into a church, they're going to get it all over again. And they're going to be told how bad they are and that they're forsaking the assembly and all this stuff that's just not true. So, I had mentioned an article that just came out this morning, and, Kelly Haynes is a friend of mine. So Kelly, if you're listening, shout out to you. Hello. But this article posted just this morning, and this article is about Kelly's story. Kelly went public with her story back, I think, in late October, early November, over at the Wartburg Watch. And Dee Parsons wrote her story. And then I wrote her story from a different perspective, actually on forgiveness, back in, I think, the second week of November. So anyway, this story published just this morning. The Burlington Free Press published a story, and it's called this: Church hired pastor without checking his criminal record, then said it didn't matter.
I'm still shaking my head when Jimmy brought this to my attention.
So this is Kelly's abuser.
Yeah.
He's the pastor of this church up in Vermont. And I quoted from one of the elders who was interviewed in this article. And this elder, see if I remember his name, Don Wood. Okay, so Don Wood said this when he was interviewed by the Burlington Free Press. He said that even if he had known of Longacre's convictions during his hiring process, it would not have changed his decision. This is a big middle finger, not only to Kelly, but to every child in that congregation, to every parent who has a child in that congregation.
He just comes out and says,
even if we would have done a criminal background check, even if he would have disclosed to us, which he didn't when he was hired.
His conviction, now keep in mind, this isn't hearsay.
That's
conviction,
right. Even if we would have known about his conviction, let me read this. This is verbatim. It would not have changed his decision. And then the same elder, Don Wood, goes on to say, the Lord has appointed him, that is Kelly's abuser, John Longacre, the Lord has appointed him as pastor, and the Lord will remove him, not anyone else. And so in my post, I said, well, I'm confused. Did Don Wood make the decision to hire a child sexual predator, or did the Lord?
Right.
On the one hand, he said, even if we would have known about his conviction, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have changed anything. And then in the next breath, he says, the Lord is the one who appointed him as pastor. The Lord will remove him, not anyone else. So it's just insanity. This is the kind of stuff that abuses victims over and over and over again.
Right.
It's no wonder they can't step foot inside of a church building. It happens
all the time, and it is happening, and it continues to happen. And obviously it needs to stop, and obviously has left a mass of people who are broken, who need to be where they can get support, and need to be where they can worship God together with other believers, but don't know where to go or what to do.
Yeah. And I think it's just tragic that we've gotten to this point where the church, as Rachel Denhollander said in an article a year ago this month, she was interviewed. I think that was Christianity Today who did this interview. Don't quote me on that. I should know this because I just wrote a post and I linked to that article. But Rachel said, the church is the most unsafe place for survivors of abuse to come to get help. And she said, and it pains me to write that, and I wish I didn't have to say that, but the truth is, the church is more destructive to victims of abuse than helpful.
And we need to see that change.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to see that change.
Because I think the damage is so long-lasting and runs so deep that I think even if churches completely change and say that they step up and they start doing the right thing and they make it a safe place for survivors, I think for so many survivors it's just way too late because of those emotional, physiological responses that they have when they walk into the church building because of their abuse.
Now.
Absolutely, yeah. That's not to say that we shouldn't do it. We need to
find a safe place, which Porch Swing Ministries is doing.
Yeah.
For many, many, many. But we need to. I just think we need to put that picture of the parent picking up that child who is broken, and that parent holding that child close. Not giving a lecture on why did the child, ride their bike in an unsafe manner, or why did they climb that steep hill or whatever, but just picking that child up, holding that child close, and providing comfort in the form of just holding that child close and saying it's going to be okay. And
getting help. And I would say this, yes. And it doesn't have to be a parent. If it's a friend
right, I'm just using
the person who's injured, and it doesn't have to be a child. No. Anybody who's injured. So whether you're a friend or a parent or a relative or whoever you are, when you see somebody who's been injured, I think going beyond the reassurance and the comfort is to help find somebody who can bring healing to them. And if you find a doctor, using that metaphor, if you find a doctor or a church leader who's heaping abuse on top of the victim, you need to step in, not the patient, not the victim. Right. You as the friend need to step in on behalf of them and shut that down and say, right. You are not going to talk to your patient this way. You're not going to talk to my friend this way. And I'm going to put you on blast. I'm going to let the world know that you are a dangerous person for abuse victims. Mm-hmm. We need to start doing that, as friends.
For the broken.
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
Do. Yes.
So we'll leave you with our truth bomb for the day. So our truth bomb is really a message for survivors of abuse. Is that if you feel stuck, if you feel like there are no good church leaders out there, if you feel like things are never going to change, first of all, know that there are good people out there. We're going to help find those people. When people are getting it right, when churches are getting it right, we really need to elevate them and let the world know. But two, the second part of that is that if your abuser is still in a position of power, if your abuser is still leading a church, if your abuser is still getting people to be wrapped around his finger and things like that, where, they're all led along, just know that eventually justice will be served. Even if it's not on this side of eternity, at least the way that we would like to see justice meted out, God genuinely cares about victims of oppression, and God will mete out this justice. It will happen.
And I love that, Jimmy. That is the greatest comfort and the greatest, I think, hope that we have.
Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you next round. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.